Before we begin, a small request. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for one reason: to give you something calm and interesting to listen to as you fall asleep. History. Real history. The kind that is full of texture and smell and ordinary human detail. Not a lecture, not a textbook. Just stories, told slowly in the dark. If you've been here before, welcome back. You know how this works. And if tonight is the night it finally works for you, if this is the video that carries you under, then before you close your eyes, consider leaving a like. It takes 2 seconds and it helps more than you know. And if you want more of this, there's a subscribe button waiting patiently just below. No pressure. It will be there when you're ready. Now, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight we're going to talk about salt. Specifically, we're going to talk about one of the most repeated facts in all of popular history. The idea that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. And we're going to find out where that story came from, what is actually true about it, what is not, and why the truth, as it turns out, is considerably more interesting than the myth. But we're not going to do this quickly. We're not going to do this in the way of a list or a summary or a slideshow with bullet points. We're going to do this the way you actually understand something, slowly, with context, with texture, with the smell of the market and the weight of a coin in your hand and the sound of a cart on a Roman road at dawn. By the time we're done, you will know more about salt, about money, about the Roman army, about trade, about language, and about the way history gets simplified into myths than you knew when you started. And with any luck, you will be asleep long before we finish. That is not an insult. That is the highest compliment this channel knows how to pay. Breathe in. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you right now. We begin. Let us start with a word. Salary. You use it almost certainly. You may have received one this month, or be waiting for one, or be thinking about one as you lie here in the dark. It is such a common word that it has lost almost all texture. It is just a word for the money you receive for your work, smooth and featureless, like a coin worn flat from handling. But the word has a history. It comes from the Latin salarium, and salarium comes from sal, which means salt. This is where the story usually ends in popular retellings. Salary comes from sal because Roman soldiers were paid in salt. End of lesson. Share the post. But that is not quite right. And the way it is not quite right is interesting. The Latin word salarium does appear in ancient sources. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, a man who will appear several times in this story because he appears in almost every story about the ancient world, having apparently written about everything, uses the word in his great encyclopedic work Naturalis Historia, written in the 1st century AD. Pliny says, "Unde et salarium militibus dictum," which translates roughly as, "from which also the word salarium for soldiers derives." The phrase he uses immediately before this is about soldiers being given an allowance to buy salt. So the evidence for the salt salary connection comes from Pliny. One source, one line. Written centuries after the practice he describes would have taken place. This is not nothing. Pliny was learned and careful, and he had access to sources that no longer exist. But it is also worth noting that Pliny was not an economist or a historian of military pay. He was a naturalist, writing a chapter about salt and its many uses, and he threw in this linguistic observation as a kind of aside. And when scholars of Roman military pay and economics actually look at the records, the papyri, the account books, the pay schedules, they do not find salt. They find coins. They find that Roman soldiers were paid primarily in silver denarii, real money, actual coins. So what was the salarium? The most likely explanation, supported by most contemporary classical scholars, is that the salarium was not pay in salt, but rather a specific allowance given for the purpose of buying salt. a line item in the soldier's compensation package, so to speak, earmarked for a particular necessary good. This is a meaningful distinction. Think about it this way. If your employer today gave you a food stipend as part of your compensation, a small amount set aside for meals, you would not say that you were paid in food. You were paid in money, some of which was designated for food. The food allowance is part of your pay, but it is not what you are paid in. The Roman soldier's salarium on this reading was something like that, a portion of the overall compensation designated for salt. Why salt specifically? We will get to that. But for now, hold on to this distinction. The myth says soldiers were paid in salt instead of money. The reality is almost certainly that soldiers were paid money, some of which was designated for salt. One word, several centuries of misquoting, a story that is technically rooted in something real, but that has grown in the telling until it no longer resembles the original. This happens constantly in history. It is, in fact, one of the most interesting things about history. The question is always, what is the real story underneath? Let us find out. Before we go further into the specifics of Roman military pay, before we talk about denarii and papyri and army account books, we should talk about salt itself. Because unless you understand what salt meant to the ancient world, none of the rest of this makes sense. You have salt in your kitchen, almost certainly. There is probably a shaker of it within arm's reach of your stove. It costs almost nothing. You use it without thinking. You have so much of it that you occasionally worry about using too much and cut back and then eventually forget and use too much again. This relationship with salt, abundant, cheap, unremarkable, is recent. Historically speaking, it is very, very recent. For most of human history, salt was the opposite of all of these things. Salt was essential and difficult to obtain. Salt was, in many times and many places, worth more than gold. Let us think about why. The human body requires sodium. This is not optional. Sodium is essential for nerve function, for muscle contraction, including the muscle in your chest that is currently beating, for the regulation of fluid in your cells, for the transmission of signals through your nervous system. Without adequate sodium you die, not slowly and peacefully, quickly and badly. In a world before processed food, before the sodium-laden preserved products that line supermarket shelves today, getting enough salt was genuinely difficult for most people. You could get some sodium from meat, from certain vegetables, but for most people, in most places, through most of history, you needed to obtain salt directly and deliberately in order to survive. This created demand. Enormous, universal, non-negotiable demand. And salt was not always easy to supply. Salt comes from two primary sources, the sea and the earth. Coastal populations could evaporate seawater, a process that requires large flat pans, reliable sun, and considerable labour. Inland populations had to either trade for it or find the occasional salt spring, salt lick, or underground deposit that geology had provided. The further you were from the coast or from a natural salt source, the more difficult and expensive salt became. In parts of West Africa, in the medieval period, salt from the Saharan deposits was traded weight for weight against gold, not as a metaphor, as a literal exchange rate. Salt for gold by weight. In China, salt was taxed so heavily and so systematically by the state that the salt monopoly was one of the primary sources of imperial revenue for thousands of years. Salt smuggling was a major crime. Salt merchants became enormously wealthy. The rise and fall of dynasties was, in part, tied to the management of salt supply. In medieval Europe, wars were fought over salt. Alliances were built around salt. The city of Venice grew rich partly because it sat astride the salt trade routes of the Adriatic. The word sauce comes from the Latin salsa, meaning salted. The word sausage comes from the Latin salsus, meaning preserved in salt. The word salad comes from sal because vegetables were dressed in salt brine. Salt is woven into the vocabulary of food, and food is woven into the vocabulary of survival, because salt was survival. Now think about the Roman army. The Roman army at its peak was an institution of somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 soldiers, stationed across an empire that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the edge of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. These soldiers were active men, working hard, sweating in armour in the Italian sun or the Syrian heat or the damp cold of the German frontier, sweating heavily, losing salt through their skin constantly. They needed to replace that salt every day in quantities that the modern desk worker, who sweats perhaps in the gym for an hour and then sits in air conditioning, cannot easily imagine. And they needed to preserve food. An army that is marching cannot always find fresh provisions. It needs food that will travel, that will last days or weeks without spoiling, and in a world without refrigeration, without vacuum sealing, without any of the food preservation technologies we take for granted, salt was the primary answer to this problem. Salted meat, salted fish, garum, the famous fermented fish sauce of the Roman world that we will come back to because garum is too interesting to leave out, hardtack biscuits. All of these things depended in various ways on salt. So when we talk about the Roman army and salt, we're talking about a fundamental operational necessity, not a luxury, not a bonus. Salt was, for a Roman soldier, as necessary as water, as necessary as iron, as necessary as boots. Of course there was a word for the salary that paid for it. Of course that word was related to salt. Salt was the organising substance of the ancient world's food economy. It would be stranger if it had not left its mark on the language. Let your shoulders settle. Let the weight of your body sink a little further into where you are lying. We're just getting started. There is a road. It still exists. You can drive it today. It runs from Rome northeast through the Apennine Mountains, through the town of Rieti, through Ascoli Piceno, and eventually reaches the Adriatic coast at the town of San Benedetto del Tronto. It is a pleasant road now, winding through hills, past stone farmhouses, through small medieval towns that sit on ridges above valleys full of olive trees. It is called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It is, according to tradition, one of the oldest roads in Italy, possibly one of the oldest roads in the world. It exists in its original form because of salt. The story goes like this. Long before Rome was Rome, when it was still a collection of hilltop settlements in the Tiber Valley, the people of the region needed salt. The nearest source of salt was the sea at the mouth of the Tiber, where the marshes along the coast were used to evaporate seawater and produce salt crystals. The route from those salt marshes to the inland settlements became, over time, a road. The road became formalised, paved, expanded. The Roman state took it over. It became one of the great arterial roads of the empire. The name has never changed. Via Salaria, the Salt Road. And this road tells us something important. Before there was an empire, before there were legions and consuls and senators and the vast machinery of Roman governance, before the Colosseum, before the aqueducts, before the famous engineering, there was a path through the hills that people walked because they needed salt. The road is older than Rome. Salt is older than civilization, or at least coeval with it, woven into the earliest structures of organised human life. The earliest known salt production sites date to roughly 6000 BC. Neolithic communities, before writing, before cities, before what we conventionally call civilization, were already organised around the extraction and distribution of salt. There is a salt mine in Romania, Lunca, that shows signs of production from around 6000 BC. There are sites in China from similar periods. The ancient Egyptians were using salt for food preservation and religious ritual by 3000 BC. Salt is everywhere in the ancient world. Salt is in the treaties. Roman alliances with foreign peoples sometimes included provisions about salt. Salt is in the religion. Offerings of salted grain meal were made to Roman gods. The priests who performed these rituals were called salii, another word built from sal. Salt is in the law. Salt is in the medicine. Salt is in the insult. When the Romans destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, after 3 Punic Wars, after one of the longest and most bitter conflicts in ancient history, the story, later, was that they salted the earth, that they sowed salt into the soil so that nothing would grow. This story is almost certainly false, a later invention, but it endured because it was psychologically true. To salt the earth was to destroy utterly, to negate even the possibility of life. Salt as destruction, as the reversal of its life-giving power. Salt is in the diplomacy. To eat salt with someone was to enter into an agreement, a bond of trust. The word companion comes from the Latin companis, one who shares bread, but the sharing of salt had a similar weight. The Arabic expression, "there is salt between us," means there is a bond between us, a shared obligation, a debt of loyalty. And salt is in the money, not just in the salary myth, but in the real, documented history of salt as currency, as a medium of exchange in cultures around the world where coined money did not exist or did not reach. The Ethiopian trader who carried salt bars as currency, the Mongolian markets where salt cakes were traded like coin, the medieval European peasant who paid taxes in salt, because the lord who collected them understood that salt, like coin, was always useful, always convertible, always real. Salt was money long before the word salary existed, which means the myth, however imprecise, points at something true. It just points imprecisely, as myths tend to do. Outside, wherever you are, the night is moving, the dark is full and quiet. You've been listening for a while now, and perhaps your eyes are heavier than they were. Perhaps your breathing has slowed a little. Good. That is as it should be. Part 4. The Roman Soldiers' Pay. The reality. Let us now talk about what the Roman soldier was actually paid. This is more complicated than the salt myth, but it is also more interesting because it gives us a window into the surprisingly sophisticated, and sometimes surprisingly familiar, economics of the ancient world. The Roman legionary at the time of Julius Caesar in the 1st century BC was paid 225 silver denarii per year. This was the stipendium, the formal military pay, the base salary, paid in coin. A denarius was a silver coin about the size of a modern dime. It was one of the most important coins in the ancient world, used across the empire, recognizable everywhere, reliably valuable. The phrase denarius gives us the letter D as an abbreviation for the British penny, used until 1971, which tells you something about how long the shadow of Rome falls. 225 denarii per year sounds like a number in a vacuum. Let us try to give it texture. A Roman legionary in the 1st century BC could buy a day's worth of basic food, grain, olive oil, a bit of salt, maybe some vinegar, for roughly a few sestertii, and there were 4 sestertii to 1 denarius. So, basic daily food cost somewhere around 1 sestertius, perhaps less, which means 225 denarii a year was genuinely livable, about 2 to 3 times the daily food cost for 365 days, with money left over for equipment maintenance, the occasional cup of wine at the camp tavern, and contributions to the burial club. But, and this is important, the soldier did not simply receive 225 denarii in his hand and walk away. Roman military pay worked through a system of deductions. The army deducted for food. The army deducted for equipment. Armour, weapons, boots were not free. The soldier was technically paying for them through his service, and these costs were taken from his pay. The army deducted for the camp, Saturnalia feast and other collective expenses. The army deducted for burial insurance, and the army almost certainly deducted for salt. This is where the salarium fits most naturally, not as the entire pay, not as a replacement for coin, but as one line in the ledger, a deduction from or an allowance within the overall pay package specifically for salt. We have actual papyri from Roman Egypt, real documents dug out of the desert sand that record pay transactions for Roman soldiers. These papyri give us the closest thing we have to primary source evidence for how military pay actually worked, and they show coin, denarii and drachmas and other monetary units. They do not show salt. What they do show is a system of deductions that is, frankly, recognisable to anyone who has looked at a modern pay stub. Gross pay, various deductions, net amount received. A bureaucratic structure built around managing the flow of money through a large institutional workforce. Rome had accountants. Rome had actuaries, in practice if not in name. Rome had something very like payroll departments, run by clerks who managed the financial records of each legion with impressive precision. The Roman army was not just a military institution, it was an economic one, a major one. At its peak, the Roman army was one of the largest single employers in the ancient world, probably the largest. The logistics of feeding, equipping, paying and managing hundreds of thousands of soldiers across a vast geography required levels of organisational sophistication that most people do not associate with the ancient world. When Julius Caesar doubled the legionary pay to 450 denarii per year, it was not just a military decision, it was an economic one. A bid for the loyalty of the troops, yes, but also a major fiscal event for the Roman state. The money to pay those soldiers had to come from somewhere, from conquest, from taxation, from the spoils of the wars that the soldiers themselves were being paid to fight. The economy of the Roman Empire was, in significant ways, a war economy. Conquest produced revenue. Revenue paid soldiers. Soldiers enabled conquest. Salt in the system was not metaphorical money. It was a necessary commodity, a line item, one small part of the vast supply chain that kept the machine running. Let your jaw relax. If your hands are holding anything, a blanket edge, a pillow, let them soften. We've mentioned garum. We should talk about garum. Garum was the salt-based condiment that the Roman world was obsessed with, in the way that another civilization might be obsessed with soy sauce, or a third with ketchup, or a fourth with fermented fish paste. Garum was all of these things in a sense, or the Roman ancestor of all of them. Here is how it was made. You took fish, small fish typically, though large fish could be used. Anchovies were particularly popular, as were mackerel and sardines and various small species of Mediterranean fish. You took the whole fish, or the entrails and blood and the parts that were not otherwise useful, and you put them in large vessels, ceramic jars, stone vats, with a great quantity of salt. The ratio was roughly 1 part fish to 2 or 3 parts salt, though this varied by recipe. You left this mixture in the sun for months. The salt caused the fish to ferment and liquefy. The natural enzymes in the fish, rather than causing the kind of spoilage that makes food dangerous, were instead preserved in a stable state by the salt, and they continued their enzymatic work slowly, breaking down the proteins of the fish into a liquid rich in amino acids, particularly glutamates, which are what give fermented and aged foods their deep, savoury, lingering flavour. What you got after straining was garum. a clear amber to brown liquid with an intensely savoury, salty, complex flavour that bore almost no resemblance to rotting fish, and a great deal of resemblance to something extraordinary. Roman cookbooks, and Rome had cookbooks, the most famous being the collection attributed to a writer called Apicius, use garum the way a modern French cook might use butter, or a modern Italian might use olive oil. It appears in virtually every recipe. Sweet dishes, savoury dishes, sauces, marinades, soups. The Romans put garum on everything, in the way that a certain generation of Western cooks put sriracha on everything, except that garum had been around for centuries before that, and had a far more sophisticated flavour profile. The production of garum was a major industry. There were garum factories, large establishments with dozens or hundreds of vats, along the coasts of Spain, North Africa, the Black Sea coast, and many other places in the Roman world. The Spanish garum was particularly prized. There are brands of ancient garum we know by name, the equivalent of a luxury food label, because archaeologists have found the amphorae, the large pottery storage vessels, with their painted labels still legible after 2,000 years. Garum sociorum, the garum of the partners, a particular alliance of producers, was considered something like the finest luxury condiment in the ancient world. It appeared in Pliny's list of the most expensive foods, alongside pepper and silphium and fine wine. A small amphora could cost as much as a good slave, which by Roman standards meant it was extraordinarily expensive. And all of this industry, this sophistication, this global trade in a fermented fish sauce, ran on salt. The fish could not ferment safely without salt. The salt killed the dangerous bacteria and created the conditions for the beneficial enzymes to work. The salt preserved the final product so that it could travel in its sealed amphorae from the production sites of Spain or North Africa to the kitchens of Rome, a journey that might take weeks or months without spoiling. Salt made garum possible. Garum made the Roman diet what it was. The Roman diet made the Roman soldier what he was. Everything connects. There is something quietly satisfying about tracing these connections, about seeing how a substance as simple as salt ramifies outward through the economy, through the culture, through the vocabulary and the cooking and the military logistics of an entire civilization. This is what history actually is, when you get below the surface of the stories. Not just dates and battles, texture, connection, the smell of a fermenting vat in the Spanish sun, the amber colour of garum in a small ceramic bowl, the particular satisfaction of something that tastes good because the chemistry is right, because the salt is doing its work. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the images come and go without holding them. We have talked about pay structures and economics. Now let us talk about the men. Let us imagine a Roman legionary. Let us make him specific. Let us call him Marcus, because Marcus is the most Roman name there is. Not a real person, but a composite, built from what the records actually tell us about who Roman soldiers were. Marcus was born somewhere in northern Italy, in the Po Valley, which by the 1st century BC had been Roman territory for roughly a century, but still had the feel of a recently incorporated province. The people spoke Latin with an accent, still thought of themselves as Italians in a sense distinct from Romans, though the distinction was fading. He was perhaps 17 when he enlisted. The legal minimum age was theoretically 16, but 17 was more common. He was not the son of an aristocrat. The aristocrats served as officers, or did not serve at all. He was the son of a farmer, a smallholder, the kind of man who owned perhaps 10 or 20 acres of land and worked it himself with his family, growing grain and grapes and olives, keeping a few animals. The farm was not doing well. The wars had been going on for a long time. The big landowners, the wealthy Roman citizens who could afford to run large estates with slave labour, were buying up the small farms. His father's land was mortgaged. Marcus had 2 brothers and a sister. The farm could not support all of them. He enlisted. The recruiting officer who signed him up would have assessed him. Height. He needed to be at least 5 feet 10 inches, the standard minimum for the legions, though in practice exceptions were made for exceptional physical fitness. Eyesight. Teeth. Hands. The hands were important. A soldier needed strong hands. Marcus's hands were good. He had been working a farm since he could walk. His eyesight was excellent. His teeth were sound. He swore the oath, the sacramentum, a solemn military oath that bound him to the service of the Roman people, to the obedience of his officers, to the standards of his legion. The oath was serious. It was not bureaucratic paperwork. It was a religious commitment sworn before the gods that changed his status fundamentally. From this moment, Marcus was a soldier. He was given his equipment, or rather, he was given the equipment and informed that the cost would be deducted from his pay over his period of service. The basic kit of a Roman legionary was extensive and heavy. The helmet, a galea, typically made of iron or bronze, with cheek guards that could be fastened under the chin and a rear brim that protected the back of the neck. The cuirass, the body armour, in Marcus's era most likely a mail shirt of interlocking iron rings. A rectangular shield, the scutum, made of layered wood covered in leather and reinforced with a central iron boss, roughly the height of a crouching man. 2 throwing javelins, the pilum, designed to bend on impact so they could not be thrown back. A short stabbing sword, the gladius, worn on the right hip, not the left, a distinctive Roman choice that allowed it to be drawn quickly even in the press of a close formation. And boots, the callagi, open-toed sandals with thick soles studded with hobnails, held in place by an elaborate system of leather straps that wrapped around the ankle and up the calf. The hobnails gave the soldiers traction on rough ground and on the stone-paved Roman roads. They also made a distinctive sound, a rhythmic, metallic, percussive sound, when a Roman army marched. Witnesses who recorded hearing a Roman army march sometimes described the sound before anything else. That sound of thousands of hobnailed boots on stone, regular as a heartbeat, was the sound of imperial power. Marcus carried all of this. He also carried, when the army was on the move, his personal equipment. Cooking pot, basic rations, tools for digging the defensive ditch that the army dug every evening when it made camp, a wooden stake for the camp wall. The total weight of what a Roman soldier carried on the march has been estimated at somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds. Some estimates go higher. The Roman nickname for the heavily laden legionary was Marius's mule, after the general Gaius Marius, who in the late 2nd century BC had reformed the Roman army and increased the weight of the standard individual equipment pack, partly to reduce the army's dependence on slow supply wagons. Marius decided that soldiers could carry more of their own supplies, and so they did. They carried so much that they were compared to pack animals. They marched up to 20 miles a day, sometimes more, 20 miles a day, with 40 to 60 pounds on your back, in armour, in the Italian summer, or the Spanish summer, or the North African summer, or the Syrian summer, under a sun that was not metaphorical but actual, bearing down on iron and bronze that absorbed and radiated heat in ways that anyone who has worn metal outdoors in summer can perhaps begin to imagine. They sweated. They sweated constantly. They sweated in quantities that the sedentary person today, in their air-conditioned room, cannot easily conceive. And when you sweat, you lose salt. Not just water, salt, sodium. The mineral that your nerves and muscles cannot function without. The Romans did not understand this in the scientific terms we use today. They did not know about electrolytes or ion channels, or the biochemistry of muscle contraction. but they knew from long experience, from the empirical evidence of armies that functioned and armies that did not, that soldiers needed salt. That soldiers who were deprived of salt became weak and sick and unable to fight. That salt was not a luxury for an army. It was as fundamental as iron or grain. This is why salt was in the soldiers' pay structure. This is why there was a salarium. Not because Romans were romantic about salt. Because Rome was a practical empire built by practical people who understood that an army that could not be adequately fed and supplied was an army that could not fight. And an army that could not fight was a problem that Rome preferred not to have. The dark of your room, the weight of your blanket, the small sounds of wherever you are, a house settling, a car in the distance, the particular quiet of late night. Rest in these sounds. They are not interruptions. They are company. Let us go to Ostia. Ostia was Rome's port city. The place where the river Tiber met the sea, about 15 miles from the city itself. It was a busy, loud, smelly, fascinating place. The point through which most of Rome's imports flowed, including the grain from Egypt and North Africa that fed the Roman urban population, including the wine and olive oil and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean, and including salt. Just north of Ostia, along the coast, lay the salt flats, the Stano di Ostia, a series of shallow lagoons between the coast road and the sea. These had been salt-producing sites since before Rome was a city. The Via Salaria began here, or near here. The salt extracted from these lagoons had been travelling up that road to the inland settlements of Latium for thousands of years. By the height of the Roman Empire, the salt works at Ostia were a major industrial enterprise. The lagoons were managed carefully. Engineers maintained the channels that allowed seawater to flow in, the sluices that controlled the water level, the flat pans where the sun and wind did the work of evaporation. Workers, some free, some slave, raked the forming salt crystals into piles, collected them, moved them to storage. The smell of the place was the smell of the sea and of brine and of hot stone and of hard work. The Roman state was deeply involved in salt production and distribution. Salt was not left entirely to private enterprise. Too important, too strategically critical. The state regulated prices. The state managed major production facilities. The state, in some periods, held something like a monopoly on salt distribution, buying cheaply from producers and selling at a fixed price to consumers. This gave salt a peculiar status in the Roman economy. It was both a commodity, something traded in markets, available for purchase, and a controlled substance, a strategic resource that the state kept its hand on. When Roman emperors periodically announced reductions in the salt price as gestures of generosity to the populace, they were making a political statement that everyone in their audience understood immediately. Salt was essential. Salt was precious. Reducing its cost was a genuine benefit to ordinary people's lives. The Roman populace of the city received the annona, a grain dole, free or subsidized grain distributed by the state to the urban poor. This is famous. What is less often mentioned is that the annona was sometimes accompanied by free or subsidized salt. Salt and grain, together, were the floor of the Roman food economy. If you had these two things, you would not starve. You could make bread. You could preserve food. You could eat. The state that controlled these two things controlled the basis of survival for the urban population, and it knew this, and it used this knowledge deliberately. Politics is, among other things, the management of the necessities of life. Rome understood this. The bread and circuses that Juvenal famously mocked, panem et circenses, were not cynical distractions. They were recognition of a real need. People who are fed and entertained are on average less likely to revolt. People who are hungry are on average more likely to. The state that manages to keep people fed has bought itself a degree of stability. Salt was part of that equation. Quiet, mineral, essential, unremarkable. Present in every meal, and therefore precisely because of its constant presence, almost invisible. The things that are most necessary are often the least visible. Breathe out. Let the breath go completely all the way to the bottom. Then let the next breath come by itself when it is ready. We should spend more time with Pliny. Gaius Plinius Secundus, Pliny the Elder as historians call him, to distinguish him from his nephew Pliny the Younger, who is also interesting but who did not die quite as dramatically. Was born in 23 AD in the town of Novum Comum, which is now Como in northern Italy. He died in 79 AD at Stabiae on the Bay of Naples, watching the eruption of Vesuvius from too close. He died watching the eruption of Vesuvius from too close because he was curious. This tells you everything you need to know about Pliny. He was a man of insatiable, compulsive, all-consuming intellectual curiosity who spent his entire life reading, taking notes, and writing, who slept as little as possible because sleeping was time that could be spent reading, who had books read to him during dinner and during bath time and during travel because there was always something new to learn, and who, when a volcano began erupting across the bay from him, did not run away. He went toward it to see. His great work, the Naturalis Historia, Natural History, is 37 books long. It covers astronomy, geography, medicine, agriculture, zoology, botany, mineralogy, art, architecture, and a great many other subjects, often in the same paragraph. It is not a systematic scientific work in any modern sense. It is a vast accumulation of information, much of it accurate, some of it wrong, all of it enthusiastically presented by a man who was more interested in telling you everything he knew than in organising it into a tidy structure. It is also one of the most quoted books in the ancient world. Later writers cited it constantly. Medieval scholars treated it as an authority on natural subjects. It was one of the first classical texts to be printed after Gutenberg in 1469, a measure of how important it was considered, and it is in Pliny's Naturalis Historia, specifically in Book 31, the book about water and aquatic substances, that we find the salt chapter. Pliny on salt is characteristically Pliny, enthusiastic, wide-ranging, sometimes precise and sometimes vague, full of fascinating details that you cannot find anywhere else, and occasionally completely wrong about things in ways that were accepted as true for centuries afterward. He tells us about the different kinds of salt: rock salt, sea salt, salt from springs, salt from the earth. He describes production methods. He notes the different colours and textures of salt from different regions. He mentions the medical uses of salt. He talks about salt in religious ritual, and then he mentions the solarium. The passage is brief. It is not elaborated. Pliny drops the word, explains it in half a sentence, and moves on. He is not making a major point about military economics. He is illustrating the importance of salt by noting that soldiers receive an allowance related to it. But because Pliny is Pliny, because his Naturalis Historia was treated as authoritative for so long, quoted by so many later writers who often did not go back to the original, this half-sentence grew. Later writers, summarising Pliny, simplified. Simplifications were summarised further. Summaries were quoted without citation. The word allowance became payment. The payment for salt became payment in salt. And somewhere along the way, over centuries of retelling, the nuance disappeared entirely. This is how myths are made from history. Not through deliberate deception, usually. Through the perfectly understandable human tendency to simplify, to remember the vivid concrete image, Roman soldiers being paid in salt, like a scene from a movie, rather than the more complex bureaucratic reality of a military payroll that included a line item for a commodity allowance. The vivid version is easier to remember, easier to repeat. It requires no explanation of Roman monetary systems, no context about the value of salt, no accounting for the distinction between payment in kind and cash allowances. It is a story, and stories travel faster than facts. This is not an argument for giving up on facts. It is an argument for understanding how myths work, what they compress, what they illuminate even in their imprecision, and what they lose. The myth of the salt salary loses the complexity, but it preserves the core truth, that salt was so essential, so valuable, so deeply embedded in Roman life and Roman logistics, that it left its mark on the word we still use in languages derived from Latin. For the money we receive for our work, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, remarkable. Let us hold a coin. The denarius was introduced around 211 BC, during the Second Punic War. The war in which Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants and came terrifyingly close to ending Rome before Rome became Rome. The need to finance a massive war effort was one driver of monetary reform. Rome needed a reliable, consistent, widely acceptable coin that could be used to pay troops, buy supplies, conduct trade across a wide area. The denarius was the answer. It was a silver coin. About 18 to 20 millimetres in diameter, slightly smaller than a modern dime, roughly the same thickness. In its early centuries, it was almost pure silver. It bore on one side an image of Roma, the goddess personification of Rome, helmeted, facing right. On the other side, usually a pair of figures in a chariot, the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, and the legend Roma. This is interesting in itself. The Romans put their city on their money, not their king. Rome had expelled its king centuries earlier, and the word rex, king, had become almost a profanity in Roman political culture. No individual ruler. The city, the community, the res publica, the public thing, which is where we get the word republic. The coin expressed in metal the ideology of the state. Later, of course, this changed. The late Republic saw military generals begin to put their own images on coins. Julius Caesar did this, which was controversial precisely because it violated the tradition. The emperors made it standard practice. Augustus, the first emperor, put his own face on the denarius, and every emperor after him did the same. The coin became a portrait gallery of Roman power, a metal record of the succession of rulers. But in the early centuries, the denarius was the city's coin, the community's coin. A denarius bought about a day's labour from an unskilled worker, or perhaps slightly more, a cheap wine at a roadside tavern, a basic meal from a street food vendor, access to the public baths, a small quantity of salt, a larger quantity of grain, the basic components of a day's survival, in other words. The denarius was calibrated to the ordinary economy of ordinary people. It was not a luxury coin. The gold aureus, worth 25 denarii, was that. It was not a tiny fractional coin for tiny transactions. The bronze, as and its fractions, served that function. It was the medium denomination, the working currency, the coin that showed up in the most transactions in the most places. Marcus, our legionary, was paid in denarii. When he received his pay, quarterly typically, he received a stack of silver coins. He could hold them. They clinked against each other. They were real and heavy and cold. Most of them, of course, would not stay in his hands long. The deductions came out, for food, for equipment, for the various levies. What remained was enough for the ordinary pleasures of camp life. The wine, the gambling that the army officially discouraged and practically tolerated, the occasional purchase from the camp market that always followed the army on the move. The camp market, the Mercatus, was its own world. It sold food and wine and tools and clothing and pottery and religious objects and countless other things. It was staffed largely by civilians who made their living following the army, a commercial ecosystem that depended entirely on military pay flowing through it. A Roman fort on the Rhine frontier was not just a military installation, it was an economic engine. The soldiers' pay flowed into the local economy, buying goods from local producers, supporting tavern keepers and potters and metal workers who settled near the fort to serve the market. Towns grew around Roman forts. Some of those towns are still cities today. Cologne, York, Vienna, Budapest, Strasbourg. The military presence seeded the landscape with economic activity that outlasted the army itself by centuries, and all of it was denominated in denarii, the universal medium, the silver promise. Marcus needed to eat. This is not a trivial observation. The question of what a Roman soldier ate, what he was supplied, what he bought himself, what he foraged, what he cooked in camp, is one of the most interesting aspects of Roman military history and one of the most revealing about the relationship between salt, economics, and everyday life. The base of the Roman soldier's diet was grain, specifically wheat, triticum, typically emmer wheat or durum wheat, the hardy varieties that grew around the Mediterranean and in the grain-producing provinces of North Africa and Egypt. A Roman soldier was expected to consume roughly 2 pounds of grain per day, a significant quantity, reflecting the caloric demands of a physically active life. This grain was not served as bread in the modern sense usually. It was more often ground coarsely and made into a porridge, pulse, or into hard, dense, unleavened flatbreads baked on the soldier's personal cooking stone or on the flat top of his mess kit. The bread of the Roman army was not the soft loaf of modern bakeries. It was hard, dense, nutritious in a specific caloric load way, filling the belly and fueling the march. With the grain came, crucially, salt. Salt was applied directly to the porridge. It was used in the preservation of the other foods in the soldier's diet: the dried meat, the pickled olives, the salted fish. The salt was both seasoning and necessity, both flavour and function. Beyond grain and salt, the Roman soldier's diet included olive oil, used in cooking and also in lamp oil, which is one of those revelatory double uses that remind you how differently resources were organised in the ancient world. Wine, specifically the low-quality wine called posca, which was wine vinegar diluted with water, with a sour, sharp taste that soldiers apparently acquired, and that served also as a mild antiseptic for wounds. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, dried peas, which provided protein and travelled well. Cured meat, when available. Garum inevitably. The Roman army also foraged extensively. When on campaign through agricultural territory, soldiers were expected to source food from the land. Grain from fields, livestock from farms, fruit from orchards. This foraging was theoretically regulated. There were rules about how much could be taken from civilians and what compensation was owed. But in practice it shaded into something more coercive, particularly in hostile territory. On the frontier, in Germany or Britain, where the land was not organised around Mediterranean-style grain agriculture, the army was more dependent on its supply chain. The long, elaborate, carefully managed system of roads and depots and ships that brought Mediterranean goods to Roman soldiers stationed at the edge of the known world. A Roman soldier in a fort on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain was eating food, grown in Egypt and Spain and North Africa, transported thousands of miles by a supply chain of remarkable efficiency and complexity. We know this because archaeologists have found the evidence: the amphora sherds, the grain deposits, the animal bones, and analysed it with modern scientific methods that can trace where food came from by its chemical signatures. Egyptian wheat in a British fort, Spanish garum on a table in Cologne, North African olive oil burning in a lamp in Budapest. The Roman Empire was a globalized food system, and salt was the thread that held it together, preserving the food through the long journeys, making possible the distribution of Mediterranean tastes and calories to the far corners of the world that Rome controlled. When we talk about Roman soldiers being paid in salt, the truth is stranger and more interesting. They were paid to maintain themselves as the human component of a global logistics system, one of whose central technologies was the preservation of food through salt. They were not paid in salt, but they were, in a profound sense, maintained by salt, enabled by it, extended across geography by it. Without salt, the Roman Empire as it existed, vast, multi-ethnic, sprawling from Scotland to Syria, would not have been possible. That is the true claim beneath the myth, and it is considerable. While we are here, in this territory of popular history, myths and the more interesting truths that underlie them, let us look at a few others, because the salt salary is not alone. History is full of these compressed stories, these vivid simplifications that point at something real while misrepresenting the particulars. There is the myth that Romans ate lying down at all times. The reality, dining while reclining, was a feature of formal banquets and upper-class dining. The famous triclinium, the three-sided reclining dining room of elite Roman houses. But ordinary Romans ate sitting at tables or standing at street food counters, exactly as we do. The reclining was aristocratic ritual, not universal Roman behaviour. There is the myth that Roman roads were perfectly straight, because Roman engineers did not know about curves. The reality, Roman road engineers were highly skilled and perfectly capable of building curves. They built straight roads where straight roads made sense, over flat terrain, and curved roads where they needed to follow topography, cross rivers at the best points, or connect towns that were not in a direct line. The famous straightness of Roman roads reflect practical efficiency, not ignorance of geometry. There is the myth that the phrase rule of thumb comes from an old law, allowing men to beat their wives with a stick no wider than their thumb. This story is almost certainly false. Legal historians have searched extensively and cannot find any such law, but it has been repeated so often that it has acquired the patina of historical fact. There is the myth that Napoleon was very short. He was in fact about 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was average for a Frenchman of his time. The confusion comes partly from British propaganda, partly from a misunderstanding of the Napoleonic measurement system, and partly from the fact that his nickname among his troops, le petit caporal, the little corporal, was an affectionate term for camaraderie, not a comment on his height. There is the myth that medieval people believed the earth was flat. They did not. The spherical shape of the earth was known and accepted by educated people throughout the medieval period. It was taught in universities, discussed in theological texts, used in astronomical calculations. Columbus's voyage was not controversial because people thought he would fall off the edge. It was controversial because educated people correctly calculated that Asia was much farther away than Columbus thought, and doubted he could carry enough supplies. Columbus was wrong, incidentally. He was saved by the accidental presence of the Americas. What do these myths have in common? They are all more vivid than the truth. They are all easy to picture. They all produce a certain satisfying feeling of knowing something unusual, something that most people do not know, something that makes the past feel foreign and slightly absurd. And they all contain, somewhere in them, a seed of something real. History is not a series of myths, but myths are not random. They cluster around the places where history is genuinely interesting, where the real story has something worth simplifying, where the truth has enough charge in it to generate a simplified version that spreads. The salt salary is one of these. The truth, that Roman soldiers were paid in coins, that their pay package included something called the salarium related to a salt allowance. That salt was so essential to the Roman world that it left its mark on the Latin language, and therefore on all the languages that descended from Latin. This truth is not less interesting than the myth. It is more interesting. It tells you about Roman bureaucracy and the sophistication of ancient economic management. It tells you about the importance of salt across human history. It tells you about how words carry history inside them, how the word salary is a small archaeological artifact, a fossil of the ancient world preserved in the amber of living language. It tells you that the ordinary things, the salt on your table, the paycheck in your account, connect back, through time, to a world that is gone but is also not entirely gone. The dark of your room, the weight of you, the night moving past outside. These things connect to all the nights before. We should linger in language for a while. Language is one of the deepest archives we have, deeper than written records in some ways because it is involuntary. People did not choose to preserve the history inside their words the way they chose to preserve certain documents. The history in language is not curated. It is just there, embedded, surviving because the words survived, carrying their histories forward without anyone paying attention to them. Salt is everywhere in English, and most of it comes from Latin, and most of the Latin comes from sal, salary as we've discussed, but also sauce, from Latin salsa, salted. The word refers to any liquid condiment, but the original meaning was specifically a salted preparation, a brine or pickle, sausage, from the same root, salsiccia, something preserved with salt. The sausage was originally a way of using the less desirable parts of an animal by salting and casing them, a preservation technique, not just a food form. Salami, from the Italian, from the Latin salare, to salt. The cured meat defined entirely by the salting process. Salad, from salata, salted things, specifically vegetables dressed with salt or brine. The original salad was not a complex preparation. It was vegetables with salt. The word carries the simplicity of its origin, salsa, which has doubled back through Spanish to mean both a spiced tomato sauce and a dance. The dance name for the sauce name for salt, salinity, saline, salinometer, an instrument for measuring salt content, all from sal. Salt itself in English is a Germanic word, from Old English selt, from Proto-Germanic saltum, but it is cognate with the Latin sal, both descending from the same ancient Proto-Indo-European root. The word for salt is one of the oldest words in the Indo-European language family. It predates writing. It predates the Silk Road. It predates Rome. The Proto-Indo-European root is reconstructed as something like seshtu-ls. Linguists use these reconstructed forms to point at words that must have existed but that no one ever wrote down. The speakers of Proto-Indo-European, a language spoken somewhere in the Eurasian steppe perhaps 6,000 years ago, the ancestor of almost all modern European and many Asian languages, had a word for salt. Of course they did. They needed salt. They had always needed salt. And when their descendants spread across Europe and Asia, carrying their language in pieces that slowly transformed into Greek and Latin and Sanskrit and Germanic and Celtic and dozens of other branches, they carried the word for salt with them. It transformed with them, sal in Latin, hals in Greek, sala in Sanskrit. Different sounds, the same word, the same thing. Salt and the word for salt have been travelling together across the world for 6,000 years. There is something moving about this, if you let yourself feel it. The people who stood on the Eurasian steppes 6,000 years ago and needed salt and had a word for it. They are your ancestors, if your ancestry is anywhere in the vast Indo-European family. The word they use for salt is inside the words you use today. You carry them with you without knowing it. This is what history is. Not just dates and battles. Connection. The long thread. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let the words be sounds now, not meanings. Let the sounds be like the sound of something distant. Wind, water, the particular murmur of a world going on in the dark. The Roman Empire did not last forever. Nothing does. The western half of the empire, centred on Rome itself, came apart gradually through the 4th and 5th centuries AD, in a process that historians still argue about. It was not a single dramatic collapse. It was more like a long unravelling, provinces detaching, armies fragmenting, currency inflating, the bureaucratic machinery of the state losing its ability to function coherently across its vast territory. And through all of this, salt remained essential. The late Roman economy was in some ways more dependent on salt than the early empire had been, because the late Roman economy was more precarious. The sophisticated global food system of the High Empire, the Egyptian grain, the Spanish garum, the North African olive oil, had become disrupted by the fragmentation of political control. Supply chains that had run smoothly when one government controlled the Mediterranean became uncertain when the Mediterranean was divided among competing states and peoples. In this environment, local food production became more important, and local food production meant, more than ever, the need to preserve food locally, which meant salt. The last Roman emperors of the West were not paid in salt, but their subjects increasingly organised their economies around it. When the Western Empire finally ended, when the last Western emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476 AD by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, what replaced it was not chaos. It was a different kind of order. The Germanic kingdoms that formed in the former Roman provinces maintained many Roman institutions. They used Roman law as a model. They continued to use Latin for official purposes. They maintained the roads, at least partly. They continued to trade, and they continued to need salt. The salt works at Ostia did not close when Rome fell. The salt works of the Adriatic coast did not close. The salt mines of the Alps and the Carpathians did not close. They changed ownership, changed management, were sometimes fought over and sometimes taxed and sometimes used as political tools by the new rulers who were building what would eventually become medieval Europe. The word salary survived too. It passed through late Latin into the Romance languages, Italian salario, Spanish salario, French salaire, and eventually, via Norman French, into English, where it sits in the language alongside hundreds of other words that carry the memory of Rome inside them, worn smooth from use, their origins invisible to the people who use them every day. When you receive your salary, by direct deposit probably, a number that appears on a screen and then disappears into a series of electronic transactions, you're participating in a chain of meaning that goes back to a half-sentence in Pliny's Encyclopedia, and through that to the actual lives of actual people who needed salt, and built roads and marched in hobnailed boots and wrote in notebooks by candlelight, and fell asleep in tents at the edge of the known world. The chain is real. It connects you to them. Marcus is on campaign. We have been with him before, during the day. Now let us be with him in the evening. Let us follow him through the end of one particular day, near the end of his service, in a campaign that has taken him far from the Po Valley of his birth. He is in Gaul, what is now France. The war, it is always the war. Somewhere, the Roman army does not have peace, only different distances from the centre of conflict, is going relatively well this season. His legion has been marching for 3 weeks. Today they made camp in a river valley, in a bend of a river whose name Marcus cannot pronounce, surrounded by fields of wheat that belong, as of this morning, to Rome, rather than to whatever chieftain managed them yesterday. The camp is up. This is the evening work that the Roman soldier does every single night, without exception. The camp must be built before rest, before dinner, before anything. A Roman marching camp was not a cluster of tents. It was a fortified enclosure with a ditch around it and an earthen wall backed with wooden stakes, with 4 gates and a regular internal layout so that any soldier from any legion could navigate it in the dark. Building it took 2 to 3 hours. It was done automatically, reflexively, after 11 years of watching and doing. Marcus is 28 now. He's been a soldier for 11 years. He has spent 11 years building this camp, every night, in every weather. His hands know the work without his mind needing to direct them. The camp is up. The cooks are working. The smell of grain porridge rises mixed with wood smoke, mixed with the particular smell of a large number of men and animals in a confined space, which is the constant background smell of Marcus's life, and which he no longer notices at all. He's been issued his salt ration with the evening supplies, a small measure of coarse grey salt in a folded square of cloth, tied at the top with a bit of cord. He tips some of it into his porridge and ties the rest off for tomorrow. The porridge is thick and plain. It is the taste of 20 years. He eats it with a wooden spoon sitting on a log beside the fire pit of his tent group. His contubernium, the 8 men who share a tent, who have shared a tent for years, who are the nearest thing he has to family after 11 years away from his actual family. The men are quiet tonight. One of them, Lucius, from somewhere in Spain originally, darker and quieter than the Italians, with a scar on his jaw from a fight 3 years ago that no one talks about, is sharpening his blade with a small whetstone. The sound is regular, meditative. Another man, Gaius, is writing a letter, the wax tablet balanced on his knee, his stylus moving slowly. A third has fallen asleep already, sitting upright against the log, his chin on his chest. Marcus eats his porridge. He can feel the day in his body, the particular accumulated tiredness of a man who has walked 20 miles in armour and spent 2 hours digging a ditch. Not unpleasant. The tiredness of someone who has been fully present in their body all day and has earned their rest. The fire is dying down. Stars are appearing above the camp, clear and dense. This far from any city there is no light pollution, and the stars are enormous and close. The Milky Way, a genuine river of light visible through the notch in the tent tops. He has looked at these stars from campsites in Italy and Spain and Gaul, and briefly on one campaign from the edge of Germany. They're always the same stars. They are the constancy in a life of movement. He thinks briefly about his brother back in Italy, who inherited the farm that was not quite enough for 2 families, but might be enough for 1. He thinks about a woman in a town 3 days' march behind them. He thinks about nothing in particular, the random drift of a tired mind. He goes to his tent. The tent is leather, goat skin, tanned and treated against rain, with a particular smell that is the smell of the inside of every tent Marcus has ever slept in. He rolls himself in his wool blanket. The ground under him is levelled, but still ground, still slightly uneven, still the particular cold of earth at night. He is asleep within minutes. Around him the camp settles. The sentries make their rounds. The Roman army maintained a careful watch schedule, with multiple guard changes through the night, because the army that slept without sentries was the army that died surprised. The horses stamp in the horse lines. The last fires burn down. The stars wheel slowly overhead, and Marcus sleeps somewhere in Gaul, in a leather tent, with his salt ration in his kit, and his denarii in the chest at the foot of his bed, and his whole life, which has mostly been this: the march, the camp, the porridge, the fire, the stars, all around him in the dark. He is not extraordinary. He's not a general or a hero or a famous man. His name will not appear in any surviving document. He will not get a biography. He is one of the hundreds of thousands of men who maintained the empire by simply showing up every day for 20 years, by eating their porridge, by sharpening their blades, by building the camp, by walking the miles. They are the real history, not the generals who commanded them, not the emperors on the coins, the men who got up every morning and did the work, and they needed salt, and they were paid for the salt, and 2,000 years later the word for that payment is still in our mouths. Let yourself rest now. Let Marcus sleep. He has earned it. You have been listening for a long time. Let that listening soften now. Let the words become background. Let the background become the dark. Let the dark become sleep. Salt does not fossilize. This is one of the challenges of studying it. Most of the things we know about the ancient world, the pottery, the coins, the bones, the buildings, survive because they are durable. They resisted the decay that takes most things back into the earth. Salt dissolves. Salt is consumed. Salt leaves almost no direct physical trace, but salt leaves indirect traces everywhere. The containers that held salt survive. The large ceramic amphorae, the wooden barrels, the woven sacks, these leave traces. The infrastructure of salt production survives. The pans, the channels, the storage facilities, the production sites with their telltale chemical signatures in the soil. The equipment of salt workers survives. We have found, in various parts of Europe, the distinctive ceramic vessels used in the evaporation process, a type of rough, expendable pottery called briquetage, made specifically for boiling brine and then discarding. It is cheap, thin, undecorated. It was used once and thrown away. And because it was so widely used for so many thousands of years at every salt production site in prehistoric and ancient Europe, it is one of the most common types of archaeological find at those sites. A mountain of throwaway pots, testifying to the continuous importance of a substance that did not itself survive. We have found the salt mines themselves. The Hallstatt salt mine in Austria, Hallstatt means in Old German something like salt place, has been worked continuously for at least 3,000 years. It is still being worked today, for tourism and for symbolism as much as production. But it was a major industrial salt source through the Bronze Age and Iron Age and Roman period. Deep in the mine, preserved by the salt itself, archaeologists have found wooden tools, leather bags, textiles, human hair, and the remains of food, all perfectly preserved by the same mineral that the miners were there to extract. The oldest preserved wooden staircase in the world was found in the Hallstatt mine. It dates to about 1100 BC. It is there because salt preserved it. We have found salt in the bodies of the dead. When ancient Egyptians mummified their dead, they used natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, to desiccate and preserve the body. The mummies that survive in museums around the world, the ones that researchers can scan with CT machines and extract DNA from and analyse for disease, are preserved because of salt. The salt was applied 3,000 years ago for religious reasons. It worked for reasons the Egyptians understood imperfectly but used correctly. Salt preserved the dead. Salt preserved the food. Salt preserved the mine timbers. Salt preserved the language. And in the absence of the salt itself, what the archaeologist finds is everything that salt preserved, everything it enabled, everything that needed it and shows its traces. The archaeology of salt is the archaeology of the world around salt, the infrastructure of production, the containers of transport, the bodies of the preserved dead, the mines and the roads and the pay records and the half-sentences in ancient encyclopedias. It is an archaeology of necessity, of the thing that made everything else possible. We are deep into the night now. If you have been listening from the beginning, you have been with this voice for a long time. The words have been coming and going, carrying their small cargoes of history and detail and texture through the dark. Some of those cargoes you will remember, most you will not, because that is what sleep does. It takes the particulars and dissolves them into something less specific, something more like a feeling, a texture, a general sense of having travelled somewhere and returned. This is fine. This is in fact the point. The history is not a test you need to pass. The facts about Roman military pay and salt allowances, and Pliny the Elder and the Via Salaria are not something you need to carry forward. They are scaffolding. They give the voice something to do while your nervous system does its own work, the slow work of settling, of releasing, of descending. But let us stay a little longer. For those of you still with us in the light, still tracking the word, still in the half-world between waking and sleep, where the mind is soft and receptive, and the words come in like waves, let us think gently about what it means for something to be necessary. Salt is necessary, not in the way that we use necessary casually. It's absolutely necessary that I check my email before bed, but in the true sense. In the sense that human physiology requires it. In the sense that without it, the cells of the body fail to maintain their proper function, the nerves fail to fire, the muscles fail to contract. The heart, your heart right now, doing its work without your attention, begins to falter. Salt is necessary the way air is necessary, the way water is necessary. And because it is necessary, it has been valuable in every human society that has ever existed. It has been traded and taxed and fought over and hoarded and celebrated and used as currency and embedded in language and written about in encyclopedias and made the subject of myths about soldiers and salaries. All because the body needs it. All because the simplest biological fact, that you require sodium to survive, propagates outward through history in 1,000 directions, leaves its mark on roads and words and economic systems and political structures. The simplest things are the most powerful. The most necessary things are the most embedded. What we cannot live without shapes the world we live in. This is worth knowing. It is worth carrying with you softly as a way of seeing the world, as a reminder that the most important forces are often the most invisible, the most taken for granted. The salt in your food, the air in your lungs, the sodium in your nerves. The night around you is full of necessary things. The darkness is necessary for sleep. The cool air is necessary for rest. The quiet is necessary for the brain to slow itself toward unconsciousness. All of these things are there, present, doing their work, because the body requires them and the world tonight is providing them. You're in a place where you can sleep. Not everyone has always had this. Not Marcus, in his leather tent in Gaul, on the hard ground. Not the plague doctor in 1347, with the weight of the day's visits in his notebook. Not the salt workers at Ostia, or the miners at Hallstatt, or the clerks who kept the payroll records of the Roman legions. They managed. They found their rest where they could. They lay down in the dark and let the day go, because that is what bodies do finally. They insist on rest. The body is wiser than the mind in this way. It knows what it needs. Salt, rest, dark, quiet. Let the body have what it needs. Let us end with what remains. Not the empire. The empire is gone. The legions are gone. The denarii are in museums or lost in the earth or dissolved into history. The garum recipes are preserved only in manuscripts that almost did not survive. The salt works at Ostia are a nature reserve now, a protected wetland where flamingos stand in shallow water, among the ruins of the evaporation pans. Flamingos where Romans made salt. But the word salary remains. In English, in Italian, in Spanish, in French, in Romanian, in Portuguese, in all the languages that carry the memory of Latin in their bones. The word remains, smooth and featureless now, used without thought, but carrying its history inside it like a seed carries the instructions for a tree. And the roads remain, some of them. The Via Salaria still exists. You can drive it. If you drive it north from Rome and turn east into the mountains, there are places where the Roman road is still visible as a slightly different line in the landscape. A raised embankment, a change in the way the vegetation grows, a straightness that is not quite natural. Not the road itself mostly, but the mark of it, the impression it made on the land over hundreds of years of use, and the need remains. The body's need for salt has not changed in 2,000 years. Your cells require sodium exactly as Marcus's cells required it. Your nerves fire by the same electrochemical mechanism. Your heart maintains its rhythm by the same process. In this sense, nothing has changed at all. The mineral need is constant. The human body is constant. The fundamental requirement, salt, rest, food, water, warmth, is constant across all of history, connecting you to every person who ever lived and needed these things and found them or did not. When you eat salt, when you reach for the shaker in the morning or eat the bag of chips you said you would not eat, you're participating in one of the oldest human activities. You're doing what people have been doing for 6,000 years of recorded history and for much longer before that. You're feeding the body what the body needs. There is something calming about this continuity, something that dissolves the anxieties of the particular moment, the particular week, the particular worry, into the long perspective. You're one person in a very long line of people who needed the same things, who felt tired at the end of the day, who found their way to sleep. The night is the same night it has always been. The dark is the same dark, and you are allowed to rest in it. The phrase salt of the earth is almost certainly familiar to you. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, from the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus tells his followers, "You are the salt of the earth." The implication is that they are preserving essential, fundamental to the world, the way salt is fundamental to food and survival. The phrase has survived 2,000 years of use, and is now a general expression for ordinary, decent, hard-working people, the kind of people who are reliable and genuine and not pretentious. The salt of the earth. It survives because the metaphor is true. Salt is essential. Salt does preserve. The comparison of a good person to salt, not gold, not silver, not something glamorous, is a comparison to something humble and necessary, something whose value is real rather than ornamental. The people who made the salt, the workers at the Ostia evaporation pans, the miners at Hallstatt, the traders who carried it along the Via Salaria, they are not the famous ones. Their names are mostly lost. The economy depended on them entirely. Without them, no garum. Without them, no preserved army rations. Without them, no salarium, no salary, no word in your mouth. The people who do necessary work are the salt of the earth. The phrase acknowledges this if you listen to it carefully enough. The salt is not decorative. It is structural. The world needs it to hold together. You may be one of these people. You may do work that is necessary and not glamorous, that holds things together quietly, that leaves no great monument behind it. The clerk who kept the payroll records of the Legion, the tanner's son who went back to work after the fever broke, the draper who left bread and ale outside the doctor's door. These are the ones the history is made of mostly, not the generals, not the emperors, the ones who showed up. You're allowed to be one of them. You're allowed to do the necessary work and then rest without needing the rest to be recognised. The body does not need recognition to sleep. It only needs the dark and the quiet and the permission to let go. The words are quieter now. Perhaps you have been asleep for a while and have surfaced briefly, catching the tail end of something. That is fine. Let yourself go back. The voice will still be here. Perhaps you are in that borderland, not asleep, not quite awake. The mind still present but not working, just receiving, the way a body receives warmth without doing anything in particular to process it. That is the best place to be. Stay there as long as you can. The history has been told, the salt myth and the salt truth, the words carrying their memories forward through time. Marcus in his tent, Pliny at his writing table, reading by lamplight, noting everything down, missing nothing, storing it all in the vast archive of his attention. The flamingos at Ostia, the stars above a Roman camp in Gaul, the sound of a whetstone on iron in the quiet of an evening fire, the particular smell of a leather tent in rain, the smooth weight of a silver coin in a calloused hand. Let these images come and go without holding them. They are not puzzles. They do not need to be organised or understood. They can just be pictures that pass through a resting mind like clouds through an empty sky. You have nothing to do right now. Nothing is required of you except this: to lie where you are lying and to let the body do what bodies do in the dark. The night will continue. The world will continue. Tomorrow will come when it comes. For now, only this. Somewhere, at this moment, there is a salt pan evaporating in the sun. The Mediterranean coast, the Adriatic, the Camargue in southern France, the salt flats of Utah, the Dead Sea, the salt lakes of Bolivia, white and blinding under altitude sun. Somewhere, wherever the geology and the climate conspire to make it possible, the ancient process is happening. Seawater evaporating under heat, leaving behind the crystals of sodium chloride, the mineral that keeps bodies functioning and food preserved and armies fed and economies organised. The process is the same as it was 6,000 years ago. The same as it was when the first traders walked the path that became the Via Salaria. The same as it was when Pliny wrote his half-sentence about the salarium in his encyclopedia. The same as it was when Marcus tipped his measure of coarse grey salt into his porridge by firelight in a Gaulish river valley. The chemistry is the chemistry. Sodium chloride is sodium chloride. The crystal forms the same way under the same conditions. The cells of the body use it the same way they have always used it. Some things do not change. Some things are simply what they are across all the centuries, all the wars and empires and languages and transformations. Salt, rest, night, the body's need. You're in the dark now, or close to it. The voice is far away or close to silence. The history is done, or close to done. The words are becoming something less than words. Rhythm, texture, the sound of a voice in a room while sleep approaches. Let it approach. You have earned your rest, whatever you did today. Even if today was hard. Even if today was one of the ones that didn't go the way you planned. You showed up. You did what you could. You are here now, which is the only place you need to be. The night is deep and quiet, and entirely on your side. Let it have you. Good night.